One. Hello, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is another edition of Design Future Live from AIGA, the Professional Association for Design. My name is Lee-Sean Huang, and I am here today with our very special guest, Michael Arndt, who is an award-winning graphic designer and author based in New York City. He is known for a signature minimalist style, and in his spare time, he can be found online correcting other people's punctuations. And he's also coming to us from his apartment, which he shares with his dog Clooney and cat Greta. So we might have an animal visit later, which could be fun. But today we're going to talk about Michael's new book, which is coming out on March 22nd in North America. It's this book you can see here. We're both holding it up: Snails and Monkey Tales, a visual guide to punctuation and symbols. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sean. Great to be here.
So why don't we start with the title of the book, because it's kind of a animal themed book, but the book is really about symbols and punctuation. Can you tell us about the backstory of the book title?
Sure. So I lived in Italy for 4 years after college. I taught English, and I taught um, English. I'm sorry, to adults, and one of my students was manager of a supermarket chain, and he was giving me his address, and he said Chiocciola. I was like Chiocciola. I was like, that's not part of your name. Like, and he's like, and I knew that meant little snail. I was like, what do you mean? He goes, yeah, the little at symbol, the little A in the circle. It's a chiocciola. And I thought he was just being cute, but that is what Italians call it. They call it a little snail, or chiocciolina would be little. You can use either one. Um, and so that's when I first learned of it. That was years ago, decades ago. And then when I did the book, I looked it up, and it seems like in pretty much, as Michael Beirut says in the forward, pretty much we're the only ones who have a boring name for it, the at symbol. Every other
Yeah.
language seems to have some kind of cute or charming name. So in Italian, it's chiocciola. In German, it's Affenschwanz. It's also called Klammeraffe. It's another type of monkey, a little spider monkey that kind of has a long curly tail. So they use both. The most I could find out is that in Swiss German, it seems Affenschwanz is more preferred, but they're both seem to be used. And then the Dutch, I don't know the Dutch word for it, but the Dutch also call it a monkey's tail.
Fun. Yeah, in Taiwan, where I'm from, it's a little mouse, 小老鼠. So
Yeah,
I feel like it's all sorts of like animalistic sort of things.
right.
And
And
food
that
too,
makes
right? It's
sense.
strudel in Israel.
Right, which is funny because a friend of mine who's from Israel on LinkedIn said, "That's right." She said, which is interesting because it's not an Israeli food. Um,
Right.
but and they do the. I looked up the Hebrew characters and they transliterate it basically strudel
Okay.
in the Hebrew letters. Yeah,
Very
and
cool.
then in Swedish it's cinnamon bun, kannibal, um, and the one I don't get is it's a little duck in Greek, a
Uh-huh.
papaki, and it's a little dog, Sabachka in Russian, which I don't. I'm not seeing the dog
Yeah, I
or
don't really
the
see the dog either.
yeah or the duck. Duck means stranger.
Very cool. Well, zooming out a little bit, how did you decide to write a book on punctuation and symbols? Because there's so much cool stuff going on in typography in general and language in general, and we often don't notice the punctuation unless it's wrong, as you um, mentioned. You like to correct other people's punctuation. So why focus a
Right,
whole book on just the punctuation symbols?
right. Well, it kind of makes sense if you know as a graphic designer, and then if you know my own history. So I love language. I I've studied 5 different languages. Studied Japanese, French, Spanish, Italian, and of course English. And I taught Italian. So I taught English in Italy. So that really sensitized me to language and the details. I also, in my work, I also do freelance work in the pharmaceutical industry. So every little scientific notation, every little comma, space, period, um, um, mark is really important. It can change the whole meaning. The FDA can reject the whole project. Um, so that kind of made me very eagle-eyed about punctuation. Um, and then it's typography. Once you blow them up, um, they just become so beautiful. And the variety. If you look at asterisks, for example, there's a spread in my book that has a whole field of asterisks. And if you're listening to the podcast, you won't see it, but um, the the variety present is just so beautiful. Let me see if I can find. Here it is. Those are all real asterisks. I didn't modify any of them in all different typefaces. And sometimes they look like little stars, which is what the word means. Asterisk comes from asteriskos in Greek, which means little star. So if you think of astronaut, asteroid, the aster flower, it all comes from the Greek star.
Wow, so they're
And
little
that's what this,
stars or little snowflakes too. I liked the ones that look like snowflakes.
that's right. Yeah, because they can have anywhere from 5 points up to 10 even.
Awesome. There's so many little stories in here and backstories, so we're only gonna have time for a few today, but I feel like the one about the pound sign or the hashtag is very much like relevant to internet culture, I guess, because we're using these hashtags every day, but it actually goes far back. Like I remember them on like the telephones, but then even before that, right? There's a whole history. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
For sure. Yeah, it goes back to ancient Roman times. So the word Libra, we have to kind of go back. I love etymology too. And that's this book is equal parts etymology, equal parts history, equal parts grammar, equal parts typography and design. So in this book, I try to come up with where the name comes from and then how the symbol developed, the visual mark, and how they kind of interweave and how that is related to the usage. So with the pound sign, it comes from the word libra, which in Latin was a scale. It was the kind that, like you think of the scales of justice or a scale at a fruit market in Europe where they weigh tomatoes and grapes. It's basically a balance. So if you think of the zodiac sign Libra, it's from the constellation that looks like a scale or a balance. And in fact, in Italian, the Libra zodiac sign is called bilancio. It's called a balance. And the attributes of Libras are equality, balance, equilibrium. When you hang something, it's the past participle pendere. Think of pendulum, something that swings from a chain or a rod. That's the past tense is pondo. So libra pondo was the weight of something hung to be measured. So that became equivalent to commerce. So it was a physical weight, but it was also monetary value. So the libra, the L part, was abbreviated to just L and became the sign for the British pound. Now it's starting to make sense, right? The pondo became pound, but the L became the initial that became the little mark. And also, exactly. And then also the lira, which is no longer in use, had the 2 lines through it, which by the way was an old way of showing an abbreviation, to put a little horizontal line through it, which is called a tittle, by the way, which is also the name for the little dot above the I's and the J's I learned doing this. Anyway, so the L became the lira symbol as well. So libra pondo was the start of the pound sign, the lira sign, the constellation, and our pound system, basically in English.
Right.
And that's why the British pound is abbreviated L. So we then abbreviate LB. So if anybody wonders why they go to the grocery store and they have the LB period, like that's not a P. Where does the LB come from? Well, that's what it comes from Libra. So let's fast forward from the ancient Roman times to medieval. The scribes would be doing everything by ink on papyrus, not papyrus, I'm sorry, the parchment. And after repetition, you start to take shortcuts. So they'd be with their quill pens, and the vertical strokes of the L and the B would become 2 vertical strokes. And then the bottom stroke of the bowl of the B was a horizontal, and they'd loop around with their pen and finish it off with a upper vertical stroke. And that eventually simplified into what we now know as the hashtag sign, the pound sign on the telephone, which is still called the pound sign. But it looks nothing like an LB to the untrained eye. But now that you know the story, it does. Then in the 60s, Bell Telephone came up with the touchtone phone, so the rotary dial. And they had a 12 square grid, and they had the 10 numbers, 0 through 9. And then they had 2 keys left over. They used the asterisk for one for the start key, and they needed a symbol for the other one. And supposedly the story goes that the engineer was a fan of Thorpe, the athlete, and so he called the symbol the octothorpe and decided to use it. He kind of brought it out of hibernation, put it on the telephone, became the pound key. Well, then 2007, when Twitter was coming to life, the um, the pound sign took on the hashtag meaning to kind of designate channels of information. And so it's had a long history and it's had a lot of names, but it all comes from Liber and Liber Ponda.
Yeah.
A long
But I think
story. It's the longest one in the book.
I just picked that one out of the hat. But yeah, I feel like there's something to like these things that we think about as like really modern and contemporary, like the hashtag, right, which is so prevalent in social media, but it has this literally ancient history to Roman times and before. We were also talking about this in our pre-interview chat about almost like a return to like pictograms or ideograms, whatever the term is, right? Like almost like hieroglyphics, but of our
Correct.
age with emojis, which folks who watched the little promo video I did for this interview saw, I use the little monkey emoji and the mouse emoji um, and stuff like that. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, like this return to pictograms in a way, or this kind of full circle?
Well, yeah. So I like when I studied Japanese, I learned that there's three. One of the reasons I studied was to learn their character system, just from a typographic standpoint. And I was fascinated to learn they use the Chinese pictographs, which they call kanji, literally Chinese characters, Chinese letters, and then they have two phonetic alphabets, and that's very interesting. And actually, their history is not very different from our own history. It's basically pictographs become phonetic letters, but then sometimes they return to being pictographs. So it's funny how like in text talk, people will write B4 and they'll write the letter B and they'll write the number 4, which is not the word itself, but phonetically you get it. You understand what's happening, right? Or CU with the letter C, or CU2 with the 2 number. Um, yeah, emoticons. There was an ad for the Ellen DeGeneres show a few years ago on the subway, on the bus stops, and it basically was a rebus. Basically, it
Mm.
was a word, and then it had a little pictogram and a word, and it was a whole thing you could read, but it was basically half in just emojis. I was like, that's really interesting. We really do seem to be going back to like a visual culture of pictures.
Right.
And I think that's because of the internet and video and Instagram, social media, and the expediency of it all, that a picture's worth 1,000 words, right?
Totally.
Um, and then because of that, people are loosening up on their grammar and their punctuation, and punctuation doesn't take as important a role as it did in my generation.
Mhm.
So that's what's curious. I do end the book with that. Is like, where is punctuation headed? Are we going to get rid of it entirely? Which I hope not, because it does serve a useful purpose. And it's beautiful, and it's interesting, and it clarifies information. So as a designer, that's basically why I'm really interested in punctuation. Is how it can be used to help clarify the message.
Right. I think that's another thing where we've seen like either a full circle or a pendulum swing. I don't know what the best visual metaphor for that is, but that point about how we're losing punctuation in some context, right? Especially in texting and maybe generationally or in different groups. Like if you put a period at the end of something that you type in a text, it could appear like a little like passive aggressive or a little bit just aggressive in that sense, rather than just a neutral, like, okay, this is the end of a sentence kind of way.
Right.
But then we also lose some of the context and the nuance, right? Where when you say a word out loud, right, you can imbue it with emotion, but if it's typed out, you don't really know from the context unless you know the person and the situation and all of these other things.
Right. And I think the most curious one of that is the exclamation point. So one of my pet peeves is overusing exclamation points. I mean, I'm a minimalist, as you said in the beginning, so that applies to punctuation as well. One exclamation point really is enough to make a sentence exclamatory. It's a superlative. I mean, you can't really get more than an exclamation point. You've already maxed out your excitement or your loudness. Um, and then, so who's to say what the right number is if you're going to start adding 2, 3, 10, 11? There are a lot of funny quotes from old writers about some people saying you should only use one punctuation in your whole lifetime, one exclamation point in your whole lifetime. One says you should never use it. Use it only if you're crazy. Blah blah blah. So attitudes have changed, because back in 1970 we used it so rarely that it didn't even merit its own key on the typewriter.
Oh
You had
wow.
to type a period, and then you had to backspace and type the dumb quote, the straight up and down line that also served as the apostrophe, the single quote, and opening and closed. And now we can't seem to write a single correspondence, even business correspondence with exclamation points. And it's exactly what you said. Somehow it comes across as cold or unfriendly. They've even done studies where there seems to be a gender gap there too, where women feel more compelled to use exclamation points so as not to appear too formal or cold. I find that really fascinating. Sad, but fascinating.
I find myself using it a lot too. I feel like I'm just like naturally enthusiastic and I want to get that across in writing.
Yeah, I'm not. So. I'm pretty low key.
Yeah.
So I don't like loud noises. I don't like a lot of visual clutter. So that extends into my punctuation. And that's another thing. Punctuation is absolutely expressive. You can tell the style of a writer by the punctuation they use. I even saw a fun graphic study project that someone did, and they took famous writers like Mark Twain and Emily Dickinson, John Steinbeck, and they took out all the words and just left the punctuation and see the patterns and how dense the punctuation was and how many commas they used versus exclamation point versus period.
Right. So let's go back like even further back into like I guess prehistory or at the beginnings of history when people started writing stuff down, because just to be clear, like originally writing didn't have punctuation, right? In a lot of writing systems, it was just letters or pictograms or things like that. And so punctuation emerged at a certain period of time in different writing systems. Why do you think that is? Like how did punctuation become, I guess at the time it was an innovation when it was first developed?
That's right. It felt over centuries. So in the book, I start out with this spread, which again, if you're watching the podcast, you won't be able to see it, but it's Greek boustropheden. So boustropheden means ox, the turning of the ox plow pattern. So back 2,000 years, 3,000 years, obviously people plowed with their oxen, farmers. Most people farmed their own food. And they'd go left to right, right to left, all day long, back and forth every single day. So that was such an ingrained movement, like motor skill in their brains. That's the way they wrote. They wrote left to right, and then the next line they would write right to left instead of having to go take their hand and go all the way back. And not only that, but the letters were backwards when they went right to left. So it became very hard to read. Right. Secondly, there were no spaces between letters or words or paragraphs. So it became even more difficult to distinguish words. Everything was a capital letter, and there was no punctuation. So it was just one continuous. It's kind of like, it's funny, we're doing this on 315. Yesterday was Pi Day. So if you look at a string of pi numbers, where the numbers just keep going on and on and on and on, no break after the one decimal point, that's what reading boustropheden was like, just one big long string of continuous numbers. So originally there wasn't much writing because papyrus was probably the first, right, and then parchment in the Middle Ages, and it wasn't really available to the masses. So any writing was done in stone, chiseled in stone. So it was obviously very important things, inscriptions on buildings and the laws on tablets. And the common man probably didn't know how to read either. So the original punctuation came from Greek speechwriters when they were trying to tell the orator where to stop, where to take a pause. They would put little dots in the words or in the margins even, and those were called theses, or in Latin distincciones. And there were three of them. There was the comma, the with a K, the periodos, like a period with OS, and the colon with a K. And they actually didn't refer to the punctuation. They referred to the phrases themselves. Right. A short phrase, like comma actually means, I believe it means to cut off, like a small snippet in Greek. And colon means a limb of something. If you think of your colon in your body, that's sort of an extension or a limb of your digestive system. And then period means orbit of a circular motion. And it referred to the actual amount of text. It was basically a phrase, a sentence, or a paragraph, or complete thought. And so those marks referred to that, and in turn, how long a pause the orator should leave to say, I'm in mid-sentence, but I'm changing my thought. I've ended a sentence, or even a longer pause, I've ended a paragraph. And so those names we still use today. It's comma, colon, and period. And that's where they came from, back in
Wow.
ancient Greece. Then they went through evolutions throughout. Basically, in the medieval times is when things really started to amp up with punctuation, when the monks started to scribe furiously. And then Gutenberg came along, they had the printed press, and then it just all took off. And there was a need for punctuation as more and more people were reading.
Wow. That is a fascinating story. Like, I guess that makes sense, right? Because you think about a period, like being a dot in punctuation, but like a period of time, for example, right? It's more about the duration. But so that, I guess that makes sense now to me, like why we call it that.
Right. And punctuation itself, the word comes from punctum, which means, if you think of puncture, like a puncture wound,
Mhm.
um, it means a dot, a little hole, a dot. So it all comes from the little, like when I design my minimalist illustrations, I always start with a circle. And when I design most things, I start with a circle. It's such a pure form, and go from there. And that's where punctuation started. It started with just a dot,
Yeah.
actually 3 dots, actually. But
I feel like we can get so deep into this. Like the book is actually really accessible, and we've shown a few spreads already. But I think it works well for both like beginners. Like you could give this to like a student or somebody who's like a long time designer and really into typography and all of this sort of stuff. Can you tell us a little bit about your process because you're both writing and illustrating your own stuff? So can you tell us how you think about this when you're approaching a book like this?
sure. So it is called a visual guide. The editor and I, we went back and forth on how to subtitle it. And I was pretty clear I wanted it to be called a visual guide because
Mhm.
that's really the inspiration behind it. I wanted something that, well, we live in an information age, right?
Yeah.
And recently so. And I mean, even Instagram is no longer just still images. It has to be video now. We want to be visually entertained. And I would argue that general public is more visually savvy than it was 20 years ago as a result. So I wanted something to appeal to the younger generation, most of
Mhm.
all, because they're the ones who are kind of eschewing punctuation, almost militant about it. No, we're not going to put periods here. No, I understand. You, what? Who cares if it's you are, or why are you are, or why are you apostrophe are you? I'm like, well, it does matter, you know. So I thought if I can make something visual, because I'm a visual learner and reader myself. I don't like a lot of text. I like to look at big pictures, basically, and I learn visually, and I'm attracted to visual things. So I said, if we can make something that's visual, that's basically make punctuation sexy, even bold, dynamic, simple, accessible, um, and let the visuals tell the story. So every page is basically more like an infographic, and there's very
Yeah.
little text. I wanted all my subheads to just be one line. I wanted all the paragraphs of copy to fit within a circle if possible, or one little paragraph, and all playing off that circle. Classic black and red and white. Um, and you can go anywhere in the book. You don't have to, it works chronologically, but you can open to any spread, read that spread, close it, and have your lesson for the day or your enjoyment for the day. Um, you get a complete story with every spread. It's almost like a little infographic poster. And that was the impetus behind the design. So when I designed it visually first with no words. I just designed like any designer would. What's the message and how can I best communicate that in the fewest means possible? So I would lay out the page, keeping in mind what spread might go before it or after it for sequence and rhythm. And then I would add copy the way an ad person works.
Yeah.
This was more copywritten than written.
Mhm.
So I would add the copy just to help explain the visuals, more as captions rather than an actual text that could be read like a novel. And so that did frustrate my editor a little bit, I think, because most editors want to receive a manuscript, right,
Right.
in Microsoft Word and edit it and spell check um, and see the whole story at a glance. Well, I didn't have the words until I had the visuals,
Right.
and I basically when I present a book, I like to design it pretty much front to back cover, even down to the copyright page, so that I know everything's going to work, everything's going to fit, everything is cohesive. I've included everything. There's no surprises. Um, And also because it is so visual, I won't know the words until I've actually designed every page.
Sure.
So that was my process, and I think it shows in the finished book. Don't you think? It ends up being a very visual book.
It does. It almost feels like an expanded version of those informational slideshows on Instagram, but in book form. Like
Right.
a little bit more like information dense because it's a bigger square, obviously, than a phone, but it does feel like that where it could like you can enjoy it from beginning to end, or you could just kind of pop in and there's a story or there's a spread about a specific thing. So it works as like both a reference and something you could read cover to cover, and it's like very bite-sized in terms of like if you want to graze or if you want to really like binge eat on uh, typography and punctuation.
Right. And I before I did the podcast, I reread the book cover to cover just to kind of refresh my memory. It's actually a quick read as well. Like you can probably read the whole thing in 20 minutes, half an hour. But you can also go back. The thing I like about it is, like you said, it's simple for beginners, for the novice, even English as a second language people can say,
Yeah.
"Oh, how do I use a?" I'm not familiar with quotation marks because we use idioms or we don't quote material that way. Or they can find something in it. Or people who really don't know how to use a comma or apostrophe, like how to put it in a possessive, which is confusing sometimes. But then my editor said, "You know what? There's at least a dozen people I can think off the top of my head. I'm going to give this to, and a lot of them are editors and writers and colleagues. So it's got that level of information
Yeah.
resource
It,
to it.
it really bridges those two worlds of like the visual designers and the writers and the editors kind of coming together around these what seem to be minutia, but you really give us this real historical context behind everything.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
Yeah, that was the goal. So I hope I achieved it.
it's kind of my philosophy in general about design. I like things to be immediately attractive and engaging. You know, think of a sign on a highway or a poster that has to grab your attention in half a second. It's got to be visually arresting. But then as you read it, there's got to be information that keeps you reading it and it makes you want to read it. But then
Right.
also, will you pick it up a year from now or 10 years from now and discover something new? I love that. I call that time release design. Um, and I think of like the Wizard of Oz. I've seen that like most people, most Americans growing up, we've seen it since we were like, since the earliest movie we can remember. It's on every year. Every time I see it, I know some other level of depth to it, some other kind of interesting meaning or concept that's woven in. And that's what I hope to do in my design. I call it deceptively simple. There's a lot of things that's like, oh, it's just this, and then they're like, oh, I didn't look at how that is that and that. So I'm hoping that on further reads, people will say, oh, okay, I didn't see that the first time.
I love that time release design. I
Mhm.
think that's a great principle for us to think through when we're writing something or designing something ourselves. So as a final question, do you have any parting words or messages that you want to give to our audience today about punctuation or about the book in general?
Well, it comes out next week, Tuesday. You can pre-order now.
That's my shameless pitch for that.
Um, I love punctuation. I think it's beautiful. My approach on this was to take like an Alice in Wonderland, down the rabbit hole where you kind of like start exploring and you get deeper and deeper into like really, I think, interesting trivia and unknown facts and terms. And also, what I did was I took the words. I like small type. I'm a designer, right? And I don't always get to do that with my clients. So the type is fairly small, still very legible, but compared to the punctuation. So I wanted to reverse that proportion, that relationship, kind of like Alice in Wonderland, where all of
Yeah.
a sudden she was tiny, everything else was large. So you have these huge exclamation points that really are awesome to behold. Or you have these like older size periods or like meteor sized asterisks. And I think that makes it exciting and it makes people say, you know what, I never realized that's what these shapes actually look like. For example, like in the beginning, there's a page just on periods, and people just as no sooner did I establish that a period comes from the word for like orbit and circle, then I kind of mix it up and I show them actually a period, and depending on the typeface, it can be a square, it can be an oval, it can be a rectangle, it can be a diamond, it can be organic shaped. And most people won't ever notice that if they're not a graphic designer, or they never blow up type that large. So I just wanted people to get interested in this kind of hidden world that everybody uses, everybody sees. We all have since we could read, but most people don't really think about.
Yeah. Well, thank you for reminding us to pay attention to these literally small details and blowing them up into large proportions so we notice them, we are curious about them, dig deeper into the history. Um, I've been live with Michael Arndt here, author of Snails and Monkey Tales, a visual guide to punctuation and symbols. You can get it wherever you get your books on March 22nd. So check out the book. And Michael, thank you for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today as well, or for listening to the recording.
Thank you, Lee-Sean.
Take care. Bye, everyone.